Hey everybody, welcome to our session today on tips and tricks with VMware Cloud and AWS with a focus on migrations and why they needn't be painful. There's a lot we're going to talk about. We're going to do it in quite a short period of time, so we'll get started. My name is Bilal Ahmed. I'm a Customer Success Cloud Architect at VMware.
And I'm Zach Zumball, Staff Cloud Customer Success Architect on VMware on Bilal's team.
Next slide, please. So the key agenda for today is we're going to talk about the discovery, the planning, and the migrating of the workloads. Now, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Zach, who's going to spend a lot of time talking about discovery. And the hint we want to get across is discovery is the most important part of all of this. If you get this right, everything else flows naturally. Next slide, please.
Yep, thanks, Bilal. So topics I'm going to cover on discovery are using RV tools and live optics for sizing your workloads, reviewing how you can use your internal tools like CMDB, discussing how you can work with app owners to plan a smooth migration, using vRealize Network Insight for networking flow discovery, and then looking at right sizing your virtual machines. Next slide, please. So RV tools and live optics are a couple of free tools that can get data from your existing workloads in your existing vSphere environment and import those into the sizing tool. So that's why I mentioned these in particular. As you can see on the graphic here, there's a simple drop down to select your exported file from these tools and import it right into the sizer, and it will give you an accurate sizing estimate for your SDDC. So instead of manually importing the number of VMs with their individual stats, these tools will take a snapshot of your workloads. They'll allow you to import it into here. And both of these tools are free. If you can't use either one of these tools, you can still manually input your sizing numbers into the sizer. So some companies have maybe a time constraint getting through change control to install these tools, or security restrictions where you just can't, you're just not allowed to run them for whatever reason. But you can always manually input the sizing numbers into the sizer. Okay, next slide. So using internal tools, so most companies have a configuration management database used to keep track of virtual machine deployments and their characteristics. It's used, among other things, to keep track of the utilization of a virtual machine. And if you have an accurate, up-to-date CMDB, this can make planning a cloud migration much easier, as you'll already have all the sizing data you need to determine the cloud resources required to migrate your virtual machine. And this should be considered the source of truth, so to speak. There's no one particular application used to track this information, and actually many companies have their own homegrown applications to track this data. And in addition to sizing, the CMDB can also contain application dependencies and relationship information, as well as the application owner information. So independent of any tools you use to analyze and size virtual machines to migrate, you'll always need to consult with the application owners. Typically, most companies have independent internal teams that deploy, manage, and maintain their applications. You'll always need to coordinate with these teams when it comes to time to migrate the applications to the cloud. And no matter how much information you track, there'll always be some information that you can only get from talking with these application owners, especially if your CMDB isn't quite as diligently maintained as you would hope. One of the first things you should consider is if the applications are even needed at all. It's really not uncommon to have orphaned applications that have been supplanted by some other applications, or simply applications that are no longer needed due to a change in business requirements. If you cannot find the owner for an application, it could potentially be considered retired and just left out of the migration plan. You'll always need to coordinate migrations with your application owners. Most companies must make application clients aware of any potential disruptions to their applications, even if they're just for internal use or a small group of users. Although with modern application tools like HCX that allow you to migrate with little or no downtime, any disruption must be accounted for and planned around. Another consideration when migrating applications are IP and DNS requirements. If your migration plan requires IP changes, you'll need the applications to function correctly after migration. And that means making sure DNS is working properly to avoid any application communication disruption.
Yeah. So a couple of things I would like to add to what Zach has said regarding app owners. They're going to be some of the most important people you talk to, because at the end of the day, the whole migration process is there to enable them to get their apps into the new environment, right? So you're going to have to sit down, talk to them, understand the application behavior. Is it a 3-tier app? Is it just single entity? Does it have any other internal replication going on that you could use instead of whatever migration process you have? And they may decide that they're happy for you to move all the VMs in one go. Or they might be a bit on edge about the whole process. So you'll migrate maybe 1 or 2, let them use it for a few days in the cloud, make sure they're happy with it before you migrate everything else. And you tell them what the rollback strategy is and everything like that as well. Because end of the day, some app owners can be very, very hesitant about moving things because it's a change to a very stable app. And they're concerned that anything that might happen might have downtime. So you can help work with them and say, okay, these 2 or 3 apps that you've got here, we can migrate them with no downtime, but it's going to be a bit slower. And then all these other ones here, which you've told us aren't really as important, we can do them in more of a bulk migration kind of way. And then you can mix and match them together to work with the app owner. And sometimes the app owners might say you can move everything, fine, you can do it quickly. Other times they might want to do it in 2 or 3 stages across different events, which is fine as well. But as long as you work with them, normally they'll be okay with you, because at the end of the day, you're only putting them into a much more beneficial position because you're migrating probably out of legacy hardware in a legacy environment that's no longer under support. So if you help them understand that they're going to be in a much better position, they'll usually be more than happy to work with you, regardless of how long it takes. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Bilal. Yeah, exactly. Some good considerations. So continuing on with discovery, we typically recommend to use vRealize Network Insight. So if you don't have a robust internal record of application dependencies, Network Insight is a tool that can help you quickly and easily determine application dependencies by analyzing networking flows. So as you can see here in this graphic, Network Insight will map out the flows and show you exactly what communication channels all of your applications are using. So you can uncover previously unknown communication channels between virtual machines to avoid any unnecessary disruption during migrations. The Network Insight will not only show you communication between virtual machines that are part of the same application deployment, but also other dependencies such as DNS, Active Directory, NGP, and other general service dependencies. So typically you'd want to leave Network Insight running for at least 30 days to capture most of the network traffic. The longer you run the analysis, the more likely you are to capture all the required communication. With 30 days is typically the sweet spot to capture the majority of required network flows. So if you don't already have vRealize Network Insight, you can utilize vRealize Network Insight Cloud, which can be run on demand for the duration of your migration planning. Right, next slide. And then finally, right sizing. So what is right sizing? Sometimes virtual machines are built to kind of like a boilerplate standard, regardless of the actual application need, or maybe even the application need, resource need has changed. So if a virtual machine has more resources than the application it's running requires, sizing requirements will be skewed when moving to the cloud, and it will result in over allocation. So by using a tool like vRealize Operations, you can analyze virtual machine utilization history and determine the optimal resource requirements required to run at an optimal performance level. This can not only allow you to reduce your footprint in the cloud for a virtual machine, but you can also find virtual machines that are resource starved as well. So you can improve their performance when they are correctly sized. All right, over to you, Bilal. Next slide.
So now we've talked about right sizing and all the discovery you can do. Let's talk some more about the planning side of things. So you've done all the hard work, you've got all that information. Now you have to find a way to get the VMs going, right? So there are a few ways you can do this, right? A lot of customers have done a VLAN per VLAN kind of plan, where you said, okay, I've got all these VMs in this VLAN 10, for example, and I'm going to move them first, get them all over to the other side, make sure everything's happy and everything's running, cut that over, and then I'm going to move to the next VLAN and to the next VLAN. Very slow, very methodical, and it does have its benefits, right? Because you're emptying the whole subnet out. And when you discover, you might find there might be some physicals left behind there. So then you have to either decide to turn them off. As Zach has said, it could be completely legacy now and nobody knows anything about it and it's not even being used. So a perfect opportunity to turn it off, right? And then once you've done the VLAN stuff, you got to look at the network cutover. When you're doing the stretches with HCX, for example, you really don't need the networking team on board. The stretch just extends a layer 2 boundary. But when it comes to the cutover and you're moving the gateway from your on-premises into VMC using NSX, you're probably going to want the networking team involved there, just so that they understand that they can see BGP, re-advertise the routes, and the routes propagate correctly. Most customers, what they do is they spin up a test VLAN, put some dummy VMs in there and go through the whole process. And if you do something like that, you instill in confidence with the app owners and with the business in general, which is really important because you want them on your side throughout the whole process. And if you can show that you're doing X, Y, and Z correctly, and you're looking at lessons learned every time, it'll only instill confidence and you'll have a much easier time winning them over. If the VLAN per VLAN kind of thing doesn't work, one option you can do is go by an app and dependency, where something like VMware's Network Insight is quite good for that. Or if you talk to the app owners, they tell you I've got this web app and DB is a typical 3-tier kind of app. So you'd group them together and you move them as a group, right? And that way you take all the dependencies together, you reduce the issues with network traffic tromboning across the network through the stretch, and you just make your life easier from that point of view. And then when you look at the how relevant the apps are and how priority they are, you can then decide what type of migration types you want to use. Yeah, HCX has lots of different ways to do it. Bulk is a general de facto, right? You can do up to 200 VMs at a time. The cutover is essentially a VM reboot. It powers off on one side and powers on the other side. vMotion is really for your heavy hitty VMs that you just can't afford downtime on. Same for RAV as well. RAV takes the benefits of bulk and mixes it in with vMotion so you can sync a lot of data beforehand and then cut over the memory and the compute part of the VM in a live fashion. Cold is good as well. If you just got VMs that are powered off, you can just cold migrate them just like you normally would. HCXDR, we've had a few customers use this for very large VMs because it gives them the confidence that they can use some of the DR features such as testing the recovery, making sure the VM powers on quite correctly at the destination. They can log into the console, check it all out without it being connected to the network. And they can just make sure that everything replicates as they want. And if it doesn't, the replication agreement's still in place. So if they have any issues, they can fix it and then sync it again later. But HCX is great and all, but if you've got DBs, maybe they've got their own inbuilt replication I personally would say if it's got its own inbuilt replication, I'd rather use that over some external type of thing like HCX. Because HCX doesn't support shared VMDKs or physical RDMs as well. So, I mean, there are ways to work around that, but it can be quite complex. If you can do it internally with the EDB, that's probably the way to go. And some customers use backup software. There are various backup softwares that will work with VMC and AWS, and you can use that. You can back it up and restore it into the cloud. And of course, there's SRM, Site Recovery Manager. That's been around for a very long time. That's supported in VMC. You can do planned migrations with that, and you can do your whole recovery plans. You can do a whole controlled planned migration into the cloud. So there are lots and lots of options. And the key thing is to use all the tools that are available to you to get you across the line. You don't have to adhere to one particular way of doing things. The key is to be flexible because every app's different, every environment's different, and you need to use what's available to you to get you across the line. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the planning it, but actually doing the migration. Now, there are various ways to do it. With HCX, yes, you can do 200 VMs at a time, but are you really going to click through the GUI that many times? It'll give you a lot of RSI, right? So you can use things like PowerCLI and CSV files to help, prep it all beforehand, and it reduces the human error factor in there as well. So based on your discovery and the information you get and you knowing where it wants to go and what network it wants to be in, you can pre-populate that beforehand. You can get the things going beforehand, even a month before. Get everything ready and prepped to make the cutover as efficient as possible. Now, stretching networks is great and everything. HCX, for example, lets you do it quite simply. But there are a few key things you need to bear in mind, especially when it comes to your migration events. Each layer 2 extension appliance can do 1 gigabit of data per flow, per TCP flow. And each appliance can handle 4 to 6 gigabyte of max throughput. So that might impact how you do your migrations, right? If you know through your discovery, for example, that a certain VLAN has loads and loads of traffic, so maybe you'll just migrate that VLAN first and then leave all the VLANs that don't have much traffic towards the end. And L2 stretches, yeah, you can open them for a long time, but they're never designed to be open forever. You're extending your layer 2 domain, which means if you have any issues, the outage could be much more difficult to deal with, right? So the key thing is stretch it for only the amount of time that you need it, do your testing, and then cut it over. Having multiple stretches open at the same time isn't ideal. Yes, there are use cases where it's important, but the more you open, the more you increase your failure domain and the bigger the risk is. And you have to communicate that with the app owners and the business as well, if that is what you're going to do. Now, yeah, you can cut over lots and lots of VMs in one go. You can even automate that if you want to be a bit risky. Sure, you can do it. I've done it, right? But especially when you're starting out, be a bit more slow and methodical, right? Do maybe 20 VMs first. Make sure you're happy, do the testing, and then move on to the next set. Because remember, if you're using something like bulk migration, there's going to be a small outage window, which is planned for, and that's accepted. But you can do it in little phases, right? So the app owners can then see their VM go down, see it come back up, and then test accordingly, right? And then move on to the next. And then when the business asks you where you are at in every point, you have a clear, precise time, and you can tell them exactly what's going on at any given time. The app owners and business will thank you for this, right? Because it can be quite stressful for them, and you're giving them a clear window to see what's going on, and you're giving them the exact feedback as and when they need it, right? And one thing I would like to add here as well is some VMs haven't been powered off in a very, very long time. So what I do advise app owners and customers to do is shortly before, maybe a week before they're actually doing the migration, reboot the VM. Just make sure it comes back, right? Because there's no point migrating a VM and then doing a short cutover and ending up in the cloud and then it not powering on properly. Then they'll most likely blame the migration event when it wasn't the migration event at fault at all. It's just a VM had some pending changes that hadn't been booted for 6 months or a year. So I always tell app owners to do that. And if they don't want to do that, that's fine. It gets logged as a risk. And then everybody understands that there could be an inherent risk there as well. All right, next slide, please.
And one thing I just want to mention for the cutover, so as Bilal mentioned, you could power on, you could do 200 at once, but you also want to consider vCenter being able to handle powering on 200 virtual machines at the same time. Could be potentially maxing it, stressing the the vCenter resources, and you could have issues with that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a very fair point. You know, you can get power on storms as well, and you've got to take those type of things into account. HCX will do its best, for example, and power on one in a more steady and controlled fashion, but you really want to be more controlled and slow and methodical. I've worked in DR for a long time and stuff like that, and I find slow, steady will win the race for you guys, and it's you just have a better awareness of what's going on around you, and you can deal with problems as they arise much quicker. On that note, look, everybody, thank you for joining. We value your feedback. Anything we did good, anything we did bad, anything we missed that you think we could add into another session, by all means, let us know, right? We're open to any kind of feedback. Myself and Zach are on Twitter, LinkedIn, and we're going to share those links as well in a little bit. You can reach out to us if you have any questions, right? We work for customer success. You're the customers, and we want you to succeed. If you win, we win. Next slide, please. Perfect. Do we have any questions? While the questions are going on, there'll be some polls as well coming through, where you can provide us any kind of feedback you want.
Oh,
So Zach, a question for you. Can you right-size VMs after you move them to the cloud?
absolutely. Yeah, actually, a lot of times. So right sizing is in a project in and of itself, right? So a lot of times customers will do the migration first. They don't really have time to kind of analyze the workloads prior to migrating. You know, have deadlines. Actually, had a customer once that their data center fire suppression system went off and wrecked a bunch of their hardware. So they were really needed to migrate immediately. So situations like that, you really don't have time to go through. But vRealize operations fully compatible with VMware Cloud and AWS, so you can really do right sizing at any time of the virtual machine's life cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I will add to that as well. Some of these VMs haven't been powered off for a long time, and this is a perfect opportunity to right-size them because you may not get this opportunity again, right? So I'd seize it because at the end of the day, there might be majority of times they're oversized, but there might be some where they're just under-resourced. So it's a perfect opportunity to resize them and make them more performant as well, right? And the business will be more than happy to do that. And this is your opportunity to seize that.
So we have a question. Are there any tools supported by VMware for migrating VMs from hyperscalers? So you can migrate from other VMware clouds like VMware, Google Cloud, VMware Engine, Azure VMware Solution, and etc. with HCX. As far as migrating from native like EC2, you could use some of the techniques like Bilal mentioned, like using a backup software, but I don't believe we have a direct tool that could migrate from like a cloud instance.
Yeah.
Bilal, you have any additional?
Yeah, I mean, HCX does support OS Assisted Migration, which does work with Hyper-V and KVM. But going from like a native cloud, you'd have to use some kind of third-party tool like Carbonite or Veeam, any of those kind of things would work. A lot of customers do it that way, just
Yeah,
to
it's
store from backup.
definitely something that's come up quite a bit. We used to have a tool called Converter, and that's not really being supported anymore.
Yeah.
But that was able to basically migrate really any kind of virtual machine. But I'm not sure where that's at on the roadmap, but it's definitely something that's come up that we're definitely working towards.
I mean, there's a question about how reliable third-party tools are. I mean, they're all pretty reliable within reason, right? They're all enterprise-grade tools, and you can use them however you see fit. We've had customers use various backup vendors to restore to the cloud. Works no problem, right? As long as it's supported by VMC and AWS, there's no reason why you couldn't use it.
Yep.
So there's a question here, Zach, for what if I don't want to purchase a license for vRealize networking site?
Yeah, well, most of our vRealize suite, I believe, is we have a comparable SaaS version. So you can run on demand, or you can run a 1 or 3 year subscription. But yeah, the vRealize Network Insight, and not only that, but vRealize Operations, and like I said, most of the vRealize suite is SaaS. It's fully compatible with on-premises and cloud, and you can just kind of run it on demand if you don't want to commit to a long-term license agreement.
Yeah, and the first 30 days are free, right? So you could easily just use it for 30 days and get what you need out of it, and then, or use it for 20 days and decide, yeah, I don't need any more than that. And you're fine with that as well. You get a one-time use of that. And so that's what some people do as well. Perfectly acceptable thing to do.
It looks like we have a raised hand in the chat. If you raise your hand, if you have a question, just you can type it, or I believe they can unmute if you want to ask live. If you did on accident, that's fine too.
Okay, so we have a question about, what happens if if getting full discovery of data is actually difficult? Now, that's an interesting one, and that comes up quite a bit, right? You can, by all means, you can continue. You have to continue, right? But you have to make the business and app owners aware that you're going to have to go on some assumptions that are very difficult to validate. Maybe the app owner no longer around. Nobody knows who owns it, but it's so critical that people are scared to turn it off. These are all things that are going to crop up, and you're going to have to move forward based on that, right? You just have to get the business and the app owners to sign off on the associated risks with that, and you'll tell them, you promise them that you'll deal with the issues as they arise. And if things do go a bit sideways, you've warned them and you've proved to them that you did try to do as much discovery as you could, and you couldn't get any more information than what you had. And now you know this information, you'll log in, you'll improve the process next time. But those type of VMs are going to be white glove VMs, and you treat them accordingly, right? With a very strict defined rollback strategy, and you do it in a very staged fashion going across. Another interesting
thing,
one.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add on, kind of like what I mentioned. A lot of times there's no choice, right?
Yeah.
If your data center's on fire, you got to move. If your hardware's expired, license, or out of date, out of support, you have to move. So that can also be a motivational tactic.
And yeah, I mean, what's the biggest risk, right? Leaving behind on legacy hardware where you've got no SLAs and you've got no support if things go wrong, or do you move it and hope for the best? And you can use it, maybe the app's never been through a proper DR test. So this could be a good way to prove that they've got some kind of process in place. And if they haven't, this is a good time to actually put one in place, right? So there is another question about, what happens if app owners don't sign off? Now, I've had this a few times in my experience where app owners just really don't want to move. They're like, I'm happy where it is. It's working fine. And, why do I want to move? Well, you have to explain to them that really you're not there to make their lives difficult. You're there because, as Zach mentioned, the data centers on aging hardware, there's no support, there's nothing there. Yeah, you can stay there, and that's fantastic. But you're the reason that data center is still on. And you're costing the business money, and you're going to have to explain to the business why you're willing to go, right? And they usually, when they have to explain those kind of things to the business will force them to move. But really, once you start telling them that, they're going to be on more performant hardware with better SLAs, it's going to be all flash with 10 gig networking, and they'll get more dedicated resource. They might even end up in a dedicated cluster, right? And they'll be able to use all these features, and hopefully the performance will improve as a result. They're usually on board with it. And what they'll ask then is, can we do it in a very slow, methodical fashion? Yeah, of course. That's not a problem at all, right? End of the day, I always say, look, we're here to work with you. Whatever you want to do, we'll find a way to make it work, right? Yes, we'll do all these 150 VMs in one go, but yours, we'll treat it with white gloves. We'll involve you in all the meetings that we have on it. We'll involve you with all the questions regarding networking, and we'll move it all in one go. And we'll do it one VM at a time if need be, right? Because at the end of the day, once you're on that new hardware, you're going to be in a much better position, right? And if they tell me that their VM hasn't ever been turned off, well, this is a perfect opportunity to do it. Because if you're not willing to turn it off, right? Have you ever tested a DR scenario? And usually when they have to go to the higher ups and explain that they've never turned it off, they never involved DR on it, they're probably not meeting some of their mandates as well. So it becomes a much more bigger discussion. But if you have the higher up, the C levels involved, when you get kickback like that, you can explain it to them. And when you start involving the C levels, they'll usually make the app owners work with you on that then. End of the day, everybody needs to get along and we need to get this project moving, right? It's not me versus them. It's not us versus them. We're there in it together. And that's the whole idea. And that's the whole thing that we need to get. We need to get there to get to the other side. Right? I think that's everything.
Yep, doesn't look like we have any other questions. Right.
I'm sure these slides will be made available as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that will be sent out. You can just click those links, and here's our contact info if you have any other questions.
Yeah, by all means, reach out to us, not a problem.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.